First of all, it's a great honor to be able to address you today. I apologize that I was unable to join you last night. I actually did arrive at the hotel at a decent hour, but by virtue of the fact that I have this silly habit of checking my email, I noticed that some little minor catastrophe had arisen, and I had to deal with it immediately, so I did not have the opportunity to come down and join you last night. Again, it's a great pleasure to come to North Carolina again. I have so many friends down here, and it's always a great pleasure to come down and see them. Of course, the opportunity to address you is always one that I relish. However, I get the impression that it was, Barbara told me, Jim, we'd love to have you come down because we're looking for a man of surpassing wisdom and virtue who can give a great speech, who can get us whipped up. But since none of them are available, we'll take you. Which, of course, made me feel really good. It's nice to be wanted. The address that I'd like to deliver today is the Libertarian Party, where we are, where we're going. And I'd like to give you my worm's eye perspective on these things. Let me start by noting that the battle for liberty takes place on many battlefields. We who are in the Libertarian Party tend to focus in many cases upon the battlefield that is the political battlefield. But there are many other battlefields, and I happen to believe that, as economists would say, politics is a lagging indicator for our ideas. We will see success in terms of the victory of the libertarian perspective on the political battlefield after we've seen success in the other battlefields or on the other battlefields. And I'm pleased to say I think we're making tremendous progress on many of those other battlefields. So let me give you sort of a little taxonomy of where I think things are in terms of those battlefields, and then I'll address the Libertarian Party in good time. There is an intellectual battlefield, a battle of ideas, where I think the libertarian perspective has had tremendous success. If you go back to the foundation of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947, near Mont Pelerin, Switzerland, if you look at what was happening in the world at that time, liberty, the libertarian perspective, was not at all well received. We had, of course, Europe was still largely in ruins at the end of the Second World War. You had expansionist Soviet communism on the march. We were seeing the beginning of the People's Revolution in China, which was to enslave roughly 1 billion or so people. We saw in most university settings in Western Europe, we saw planning, enthusiasm for the welfare state as the dominant intellectual climate. Politically, of course, we had socialist governments in the United States and in Great Britain, socialist in everything except name. Of course, the end of the Roosevelt administration. Of course, Winston Churchill was turfed out of government by the Labor Party at the end of World War II. So if you looked at the state of the world in 1947, liberty did not seem to be in a particularly good position. If you come forward, however, from 1947, if you look at the progress of libertarian ideas, I think that progress has been nothing short of amazing. We now have people throughout the academies who are self-identified libertarians who believe in the basic libertarian perspective of individual liberty coupled with personal responsibility. The people on the other side of the fence know that we have a rise of the libertarians. They are lamenting this bitterly. Let me illustrate, by the way, a little tidbit. A few years ago, a good buddy of mine, Gary Westmoreland, and I were wandering around the University of Virginia in advance of the return of students to the university in the fall. We like to put up a lot of libertarian propaganda around the university before the students arrive. And we came across an advertisement for the Advocacy Institute asking for people to come to Washington and work for the Advocacy Institute, interns in particular. The Advocacy Institute at the time was run by Michael Perchuk, who was Jimmy Carter's FTC commissioner and not at all a friend of liberty. And the second bullet point, the second internship for which the Advocacy Institute was advertising was, come to Washington, D.C. to help fight libertarian rhetoric in the media. Now, I had a big smile on my ugly mug when I saw that. Another little tidbit I'll share with you, same year actually, I was sitting in my office in mid-September, this was 1997 actually, when my phone rang and a buddy of mine said, Jim, are you going to go hear Fareed Zakaria tonight? Dr. Zakaria at the time was managing editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. He was speaking at the Jefferson Society. And I said, no, I'm too busy. Jim, do you know what Dr. Zakaria's address title is? No. Are libertarians nuts? So at 8 o'clock, I was seated right in front of Dr. Zakaria, who, as non-English native speakers, delivered an address in absolutely flawless English. He's from Pakistan originally. And he started off his address by saying, I was told at dinner that the libertarian contingent is pretty large here at UVA, and I started to get another smile on my ugly mug. He then proceeded to point out that his address was going to be what's wrong with democracy. And he proceeded to give an address that pointed out what's wrong with pursuing democracy as opposed to what we really want, which is limited government, rule of law, private property. In other words, the classical liberal or libertarian vision. And he gave a talk that I think most libertarians would find extremely congenial. And I turned around and looked at the faces of the socialists who had invited Dr. Zakaria to speak there, and they were all getting pouty faces. Now, I mention this because it actually is an interesting illustration of a point that I'm trying to make. Why would someone such as Dr. Zakaria, who's a major intellectual figure, come to the University of Virginia and give an address that is advertised as why libertarians or are libertarians nuts? Why would somebody give an address like that unless he thought, one, people are interested, they think that this libertarian stuff must be of some interest, and it should be discussed. By the way, Dr. Zakaria's conclusion was, again, what we really do want is basically the classical liberal or libertarian perspective, that pursuit of democracy, they have democracy in various hellholes around the world, that democracy is not what we really want. At least in the sense of, do we drive on the right-hand side of the road or the left-hand side? It is, democracy is okay for deciding things like that, but not for much else. If you look at the battle for ideas, and I was a jock in my younger days. I tend to put things in terms of athletic matters. I think we are in the second or perhaps third round of a 15-round prize fight where the champion, the guy wearing the championship belt, is welfare state liberalism. Incidentally, Marxism is not dead in the Western world, but as the English would say, it's not at all well. There are very few people who actually seem to believe anything Karl Marx wrote. And frankly, there are not all that many people who've actually read anything that Karl Marx wrote. But, welfare state liberalism seems to be, to the extent that there is a dominant intellectual orthodoxy, at least particularly in the area where people traffic in ideas, it tends to be the notion that you actually do have right to private property, but you rent, you don't own. Government really owns the property. You pay very high taxes. We have large social safety nets, so to speak. Welfare state liberalism, I think, is, to the extent there is a dominant orthodoxy, that would be it. However, the libertarian perspective is the number one challenger to the belt. And the people in the welfare state liberalism, they're scared because they see the extent to which the bright, talented young people are of libertarian disposition. You've probably seen more and more that people, in many cases people of substantial intellectual representation, people of the statist variety, now have to spend a non-trivial fraction of their time going after us, criticizing libertarianism. It would be nice, by the way, if they actually knew what it was that they were criticizing. Sometimes you read the critiques and you get the impression, I criticize this too. Of course, it bears no resemblance whatsoever to what I consider to be the libertarian perspective. So on the battlefront for ideas, I think we're making tremendous progress, and we're just going to see that progress continue. Final point, I had the pleasure a few weeks ago of addressing the third annual European Students for Liberty Conference at the Humboldt University in Berlin. You would have been absolutely delighted to see the bright, talented people from all over Europe, actually all over the world, but particularly Europe. Young people who understand well the ideas of individual liberty coupled with personal responsibility. Not only do they understand it, they can articulate it well, and they're nice people. They're the sort of people to whom others will listen. They can explain the ideas in a way that make those ideas seem natural and attractive, which is what they are, natural and attractive. Other battlefields, there's a battlefield for culture. I think there are certain cultural institutions in society that make it more or less likely that a libertarian society will be well received, and if it is received, if it becomes the way things operate, whether or not it'll be a good society. And I think that we haven't made nearly as much progress on that front as I would like. I think more and more we have this, there ought to be a law cultural bias in society. Now, you might say, well, Jim, is this part and parcel of the intellectual battle? Well, the battle lines, by the way, the battlefields are not brightly lined, demarcated. I think that the battle for culture exists in many ways. It's not really part of that intellectual battlefield. When I was growing up as a boy, my mommy and daddy, I chose my parents wisely. I wanted the best, and that's what I got. My mommy and daddy, as a matter of culture, taught me, you don't bother other people. You don't take their stuff. If you do something that might impinge negatively upon it, you give it a real good think before you do it. You do not engage in trying to hurt other people. Now, it was not because my mommy and daddy had sat down and thought through, let me see about the deontological matters involved here. It's because it was the culture in which they were raised. You just respected your neighbors. If you were a smoker, you didn't smoke in the presence of other people, not because there was some sort of law, but because you just didn't want to offend. You didn't want to hurt other people. And I think, unfortunately, we've seen some retreat in this notion of a culture of respect. Because I think if we want to have a libertarian society that will be a good society, one in which people would want to live, there needs to be a basic respect on a gut level for what's thine and what's mine. And unfortunately, I think maybe some libertarians have not paid enough attention to these issues. I think there's also a spiritual battlefield. Many of you may be aware of the so-called human potential movement, the idea, how do we find institutions in society that allow people to essentially maximize their actualization, that they can be all they can be? And I don't mean joining the army. I mean, they can be all they can be. More and more, I think people in that area, for whom those questions are extremely important, are starting to say, if you really want to allow people to self-actualize, it must be done in an environment of liberty coupled with responsibility. More and more are starting to see that, and I think that is a very good sign. What about the political battlefield? Again, I think politics is a lagging indicator. I think that we are fighting, by the way, in a rigged game in which our opponents get to make our rules for us. You probably know something about that in North Carolina. I'm willing to go out on a limb there. I think it's important for us to understand some of the problems we face before we can analyze where we're likely to go. First of all, and this, I sometimes find myself at odds with some of my libertarian friends. I don't think the people in the United States are nearly as libertarian as we would like. I think that there is a leave me alone tradition in this country that has helped keep us from going much further in a statist direction. But friends, leave me alone is not a libertarian sentiment. Leave me alone means leave me alone. Doesn't mean leave you alone. Cut my taxes means cut my taxes. It doesn't mean cut your taxes or Bill Gates' taxes. I think that this country, there is a heritage, a basic heritage of leave me alone that does help us. But unfortunately, that's not enough. People say, I want to be free. Yes, are you willing to let others be free? That's the key issue. We libertarians are willing to let other people live their lives the way they see fit as long as they don't violate the like rights of others. That's the distinction. So I wish it were true. I frankly do not share the perspective that people are just naturally libertarian. They don't know it yet. I can tell you there's several people I've seen who they know they ain't libertarian and they ain't going to change. We may have to change them for them. I think we also need to recognize that we play with a very nasty, what statisticians would call a selection bias. By the way, I have the honor of teaching statistics. I've become sort of Mr. Statistics in the engineering school at the university, which shows you God has a sense of humor, because the first time I was involved with a statistics course was when I was teaching. Learning by doing, I guess it is. We face a selection bias issue, and that is libertarians don't like politics. Every one of you is unusual among self-identified libertarians because you were willing to invest some non-trivial fraction of your time, one of the greatest forms of wealth you have, to be involved in active, purposeful political activity to move us in the direction of liberty and responsibility. Every one of you is at least one standard deviation outside the norm. Some of you, I can tell you, we're talking Six Sigma here. Some of you are way out on the tail of the distribution. And this is a problem for us. The vast majority of people of libertarian disposition, they simply want to live their lives in peace and harmony with their neighbors. They're so busy with their lives, their families, their jobs, their enthusiasms, that they don't have the time. In many cases, they don't have the interest in being involved in purposeful political activity. The biggest short-term task of the Libertarian Party, I would argue, is to get libertarians to join the Libertarian Party. Because there are many people of libertarian disposition who are, I think they are with us. They agree with us on our policy positions. They agree with us on our general perspective, but they're not willing to be involved. And we need to find ways in which we can get them to help us in some fashion, even if it's not in the sense of working a precinct, it's not in the sense of being out and running for candidates. We need to find ways in which they can help us. By the way, my friend Steve, the late Steve Reed, pointed out beautifully an important point that I think is underappreciated. Libertarian is an adjective as well as a noun. There are people who are libertarian adjective in the sense that their basic perspective accords with our notions of individual liberty coupled with personal responsibility. These people may not be self-identified libertarians. They may disagree with us on certain discrete issues. But their general perspective, their general outlook is libertarian. And it's important that we understand that even though there may be people who disagree with us on certain discrete issues, and they may be important issues to us, they may agree with us on a lot more. And we need to find ways to help people who are libertarian adjective to feel more comfortable with us libertarians nouns. In fact, we want to get them to move from libertarian adjective to libertarian noun. We need to understand that we are in a very wealthy society where life for most people is pretty damn good. And this sets up a problem for those of us of libertarian disposition because we are arguing that society can be so much better if we allow people to be free but force them to be responsible. For many people, that's something of a hard sell because they know better the devil you know than the devil you know not. We are asking people in many cases to reevaluate at a fundamental level the relationship between the individual and the state. And for some people, the notion that markets, that free people interacting without the big stick of the state over them, that they can bring about peace, harmony, and wealth, that seems utterly fantastic. I'll share with you, it's actually an apocryphal story, although I'm willing to bet a lot of money it's true because of the people from whom I heard it, that when the Soviet Union kind of collapsed, at least the worst aspects of it collapsed, they still have some bad aspects of it, sort of like the United States. When the worst aspects collapsed, there was a gathering of liberals in the libertarian sense of the term, in St. Petersburg. And one of the liberals supposedly got up and said, "Here in Russia, we need to solve problems by civil society. Of course, there are certain problems only state can deal with, such as roads, military, and of course, bakeries." Now, it's possible that this person was trying to be funny, that this was ironic humor. But let's think about this for a moment. If you've grown up in a society where you have never seen bread produced by the voluntary interactions of free people, you gotta grow the grain. You gotta bring it together and make bread out of it, and then you gotta distribute it. If you've never seen that done, absent government involvement, it might seem utterly fantastic that bakeries can produce bread. We need to understand that many of our friends and neighbors, good people, when we talk about ending drug prohibition because it's the best way to deal with the problems of drug abuse, for them that's utterly fantastic. When we suggest that giving police powers to the Food and Drug Administration may kill more people than it helps, for them that might seem, from what alien world did you emerge? If we suggest that the United States has neither the moral charge nor the technical competence to serve as the world policeman, well, Are you in favor of the terrorists? No, as a matter of fact, I'm not. I actually think we'll probably create far fewer terrorists if we quit trying to police the world. But for many people, our ideas are, at least some of those ideas, seem utterly fantastic. As an aside, let me note something. I have the honor of giving a lot of talks on how we can explain and promote the ideas of liberty. And one thing that it's important for us to realize, two things actually. Among the things it's important for us to realize are the following. When we speak to others about why a libertarian society has so much more promise to be a better society, for example, ending drug prohibition. It may be useful, by the way, when I was a schoolboy many centuries ago, I thought that this notion of a libertarian society, when I first encountered it, I kind of liked it because I didn't want to hit my neighbors over the head with a great big stick. The idea of forcing them to live life the way I saw fit, I didn't think much of that idea. I kind of liked this individual liberty, personal responsibility stuff. But I had very real questions. Would a libertarian society be a good society? Would it be a society in which I'd want to live? Because I don't want to see little old ladies, who have no means of support thrown out of their houses. I don't want to see some poor slob who's worked hard, who can't afford health care. I want to see people helped. I don't want to see drug-crazed fiends running around creating mayhem. And I had very real questions about if we ended drug prohibition, would we have a much worse society? I now realize that if you actually want a pretty good discriminator as to who believes in individual liberty and who doesn't, ask them about their position on drug prohibition. But my point is, we're asking people, when we talk about drug prohibition, in some cases it's hard for us to understand. How do you not understand this? The arguments are so clearly in favor of ending drug prohibition. How can you possibly continue to endorse this? We need to realize that the reason these arguments are so clear to us is because we've thought about them for a long time. Any of you musicians out there? I'm a very bad violinist. I was the concertmaster of my hometown orchestra. You've heard of the blind leading the blind. This was the deaf leading the deaf. My dad used to compare me to Yasha Heifetz. A Heifetz he ain't. I'm sorry, it's an old Sam Levinson joke. There are certain things, when I first picked up a violin, I couldn't do for the life of me. Now I do them as a matter of second nature. I'm also a very bad drummer. I'm basically getting to the point where I'm mediocre. I was horrible. I'm now approaching mediocrity. I can now keep a pretty decent backbeat in 4/4 time. When I first started banging on my pots and pans, even 4/4 time keeping a decent backbeat was very difficult. Now I can do certain things without even thinking about them. And I point this out because in many cases when we engage our friends and neighbors, we need to understand we've thought about these ideas. They may be second nature to us. It may be hard for us to understand. There was a time when we didn't embrace these ideas. So we have to have a sense of humility. We have to have a sense of empathy and sympathy with those with whom we're sharing this. It's not that they're stupid. It's not that they're evil, although there are stupid and evil people out there. Most people are not. We need to understand that when we share these ideas, it may take people a while to embrace them. Second point, understand that when we ask people to reevaluate their perspective, the perspective as to what is the proper relationship between the individual and the state, we're asking them to do something very difficult, and that is to go through a very painful self-examination. Let's say that you have believed for many years in minimum wage laws because you genuinely wanted to help people who were on what you considered the lower end of the economic ladder. You believed in minimum wage laws because it would help the working man, help the working poor. You genuinely believe that. Well, when you find out that minimum wage laws may hurt the very people they're putatively intended to help, that would be incredibly painful. I mean, that's the sort of examination. I don't know how many of us would want to have to engage in that sort of painful self-examination. So understand, when you share your ideas with people, you may be asking them to do something that is very painful for them. They may find that they have been living a lie. If I asked you, ma'am, who are you? I suspect that your response would include your beliefs, your values, your enthusiasms. If you find that you have been embracing, perhaps militantly working for certain positions that you find now hurt the very people you wanted to help, that would be incredibly painful. So let us understand what we're asking people to do when we share the perspective of liberty and responsibility. Now, I've talked about some of the problems that we work in, and again, we could go on for a very long period of time dealing with the issues of the rigged game in which we play, the fact that our opponents get to set the rules for us, and they don't play fair, at least not always. Let me discuss some of the things that I believe show that we are moving in the right direction, and that I tend to be very optimistic long run about the triumph of the libertarian perspective. The first reason, arguably the most important reason, is we're right. The ideas of individual liberty coupled with personal responsibility are frankly the right ideas. Societies based upon principles of individual liberty coupled with personal responsibility are wealthier societies, I think, by any reasonable metric. And I don't mean, when I say wealthier, I don't mean necessarily more TV sets or toaster ovens or automobiles. I mean wealthier in the sense that you can pursue your vision, your dream, your God. The only restriction is that you can't violate the like rights of your neighbors. Ladies and gentlemen, that's truly a beautiful, compelling vision. It's a vision of love. Because we're willing to say to our neighbors, I may disagree with how you choose to live your life. I may find your particular choices disgusting. But as long as your actions don't violate the like rights of your neighbors, I'm going to let you live your life your way. At least in the sense, I'm not going to hit you over the head with the big stick of the state. That's a truly beautiful, loving perspective. And like the old Monty Python line goes, I'm not only proud about it, I'm smug about it. I think more and more our friends and neighbors are starting to realize the big cost of the overly large, overly expensive, overly intrusive state. We're starting to see more and more people, particularly young people, starting to realize that the big state has a big cost. And more people are starting to realize maybe they don't want to pay that cost. Also, they're starting to realize they don't necessarily want to stick other people with the cost, which is, by the way, I think that's the big issue. They don't want to pay the cost. No one wants to pay the cost. Are they willing to stick other people with the check? More and more, I think we're seeing people who look at the evidence and are starting to say, liberty is better. Again, I have the honor of working with young people. I'm a university professor. I didn't want to have to work for a living, so I became a university professor. I have the honor of serving as a member of the Board of Advisors for Students for Liberty, which, by the way, as an organization has just done absolutely wonderful work. I'm tickled pink to see the extraordinary work they've done. More and more, the bright, talented young people, the creme de la creme of young, talented, thoughtful people, young people, are starting to embrace the notion that society, that governments exist basically to protect our rights. To the extent they have any validity at all, they are there simply to protect our rights. They're not there to get us to eat our vegetables. They're not there to tuck us in bed at night. They're there to protect our rights. That's a big enough job. It's a tough enough job. It's not supposed to do basically anything else. And so I see the bright, talented young people who can articulate these ideas. I see the extraordinary costs and burdens of the state now are being felt more and more. Also, as I'm sure you have noticed, the defenders of the big state, the reactionary defenders of the big state, are becoming increasingly nasty and violent in terms of enforcing various laws. For example, you happen to have a camera where you happen to watch a cop beating the snot out of some poor slob. Well, the cop may come and take your camera away. Or they're making it harder and harder for the citizens to assemble and demand redress of their grievances. We're starting to see the iron fist emerge from the velvet glove. It's actually faux velvet. It's not real velvet. So more and more, I think we're starting to see what happens when the big costs of the big state are made manifest. Now, am I willing to get up and start saying, am I going to start singing Tomorrow Belongs to Me? Well, I wouldn't sing that song for a variety of reasons. Any of you who've seen Cabaret, no, I'm probably not going to sing that song. Also, I don't sing very well. But I tend to be very optimistic. I see a lot of good signs, one of which is the performance of organizations such as the Libertarian Party of North Carolina. You all have managed, despite enormous burdens, to grow the party, to start bringing more and more people into the Liberty family. And I don't mean necessarily people who are just actually getting involved, becoming members, and being active. But more and more you're starting to touch people to explain to them why liberty and personal responsibility is the right way to go. And your political opponents, our political opponents, they know we're around. and they're starting to say, oh, shoot. Shoot is not the right word. Those libertarians, they're really making progress. And you can see it, by the way, as a little bit of, in my opinion, good political history. The Republican Party in particular, when Ronnie Reagan was elected president, he was able to keep an amalgam together in the Republican Party. The amalgam consisted of what I'll call big business or country club Republicans, social conservative Republicans, and libertarian Republicans together. Well, that amalgam failed a long time ago, and we're now starting to see more and more people of libertarian disposition who at one point were self-identified Republicans, in some cases still self-identified Republicans, who are more and more starting to identify, at least affectionately, with the libertarians. The same thing is true, by the way, of many of what we would have called the hard left. Many of these people are extremely disgusted and sickened by American interventionism, the restrictions on free speech, government surveillance, or surveillance, as the English would say. And more, they're starting to find common cause with those of us in the libertarian movement, generally the Libertarian Party in particular. So I tend to be very optimistic long run. Now, how long is long run? Well, they say forecasting is difficult, particularly when it concerns the future. I don't know when we're going to see the triumph of the libertarian revolution. And I'm not a determinist. I don't think these things are predetermined. I just happen to think that our ideas are better ideas, and that better ideas triumph in the long run. And so with that, I'll open it up to questions, comments, arguments, whatever you have. Question? The gentleman here. Yes, sir.
I have a very practical question. I'm the chairman of the New Hanover County Party. How can we open a branch of your student organization at our UNCW campus? What can I do?
Please contact me, and I'll be happy to work with you in whatever fashion I can. The most important way, first of all, the gentleman's question was, how can the group at University of North Carolina, Wilmington, how can UNC Wilmington open up a branch of libertarian groups, or a branch of the libertarian groups at UNCW? Let me note, by the way, I've been involved in building libertarian groups on college campuses for about 30 years. One of the pieces of advice that I give to anyone who wants to start a libertarian group, either someone who's a student or someone who's not a student, is if you're going to start one group, start two. The first group, and I'll say, I think the more important group to start is one that is libertarian educational. It's not a partisan organization. Most libertarians are not Libertarian Party people. I think it's more important on the margin to emphasize the libertarian ideas than it is the party. So if you have to start one and only one, I would say start the educational group, because I think the long-run benefit is much greater. But if you're going to start one, start two. Start a second group that is explicitly Libertarian Party-oriented. Many people, again, libertarians, will be involved in the educational group. They won't necessarily want to be involved in the political group. There are some libertarians who, they know the libertarian stuff. They don't need to be educated anymore. They're only interested in the partisan political stuff. If you can start one, you can usually start two. Typically, the marginal cost of starting a second group is not all that great. Now, at the University of Virginia, by the way, we've had 8 libertarian organizations there. We believe in trying to start different libertarian groups to address certain different purposes. Now, I should note, not all of these groups are very large. The groups are run by basically the same people. It's pretty incestuous. But there's nothing wrong with making yourself look a lot bigger. You shouldn't lie about it. But there's nothing wrong with making yourself look bigger. Some of you may remember the 1996 Libertarian Presidential Nominating Convention was held in Washington, D.C. David Broder covered a convention for the Washington Post and then wrote about it in his column that syndicated with something like 350 papers at the time. I was one of the people he interviewed. I was the first person to whom he referred in his op-ed piece. And it said, Professor James Lark, advisor to the 8 libertarian organizations at the University of Virginia. I didn't think it was necessary to point out that some of these groups were very small, and yes, they're all run by the same people. If he'd asked me, I would have told him. But I didn't feel the compulsion to volunteer this information. So there's nothing wrong with making yourself look larger. I'm always looking for ways in which we can find leverage. This is why if you can start groups without too much difficulty, have a group that is devoted to ending drug prohibition, or to promoting a robust interpretation of the right to keep and bear arms, or other specific issue focused. You want to have general libertarian educational groups, but you also want to have groups that focus upon specific discrete issues. So try to build as big a family as possible. I will be delighted to work with you. As I told several of my friends, you can consider me like a pack mule, strong back, weak mind. If I can be of assistance to you, please don't hesitate to ask. The worst that happens is I say, go away because I'm too busy for the moment, but I'll get back to you. Further questions or comments?
It seems to me I've seen people defecting from the Republican Party to the Libertarian Party, but not from the Democratic Party to the Libertarian Party. And my theory is that the people in the Democratic Party have a different psychological makeup in terms of what's driving them, which I understand is more of a caring value focus, whereas the Republicans have values spread out over different value sets, and therefore kind of trigger on all those values, and different, probably some value that the Democrats don't really focus on.
I don't know. Did everyone hear the gentleman's question or comment? Okay. Let me start by noting an interesting phenomenon at the University of... by the way, I still do. I still go and sit at information tables and hand out libertarian propaganda. I mean, I think it's important to do that. At the University of Virginia, I still sit at information tables to try to give out libertarian stuff to people who are interested. Typically, when we would set up an Operation Politically Homeless kit to have people come and plot themselves on the diamond chart, if there was a young Republican group, and there is a young Republican group at the university, its leaders would come over, and in many cases, they would end up in the Libertarian quadrant. None of the leaders of the campus Democrats have ever come over to talk to us or to engage us. I don't know why that is. It's certainly not because we discourage them. No Democrats need to come over here. Quite the contrary. Now, we do get people who, by the way, would be considered progressives, not Democrats, but progressives. So we do, in some cases, they want to come over and argue, but in many cases, they're actually very sympathetic on a lot of our issues. Some of you may have seen reference to a very interesting study. It was actually done, at least part of it was done by a professor at the University of Virginia, Professor Haidt or Haidt, I'm not sure how he pronounces it, where he said an interesting phenomenon emerged. He, by the way, considers himself a liberal in the contemporary sense of the term. He said that people of conservative or libertarian disposition seem to be much better at understanding the arguments of people on the other side of the fence than progressives and liberals are at understanding conservative and libertarian arguments. And I saw some very interesting discussion of this, and frankly, some seat-of-the-pants evidence that I have suggests that that's correct. One libertarian at the George Mason University School of Law said, he basically summarized this by saying that libertarians look at, say, statists as basically being good people who have bad ideas. Statists look at libertarians as evil. If that asymmetry holds, I think, frankly, that would explain a lot if indeed it is true. I've seen some seat-of-the-pants evidence. It is true. Again, I'm not enough of a scholar in that area. I haven't done enough data analysis to try to generalize. But there does seem to be something to that, at least, again, just seat-of-the-pants evidence. On the other hand, many of my libertarian friends, used to be Trotskyists. David Ramsey Steele, who wrote the book From Marx to Mises, he was a Trot in his younger days. And by the way, English Marxists are amongst the nastiest bastards on the planet. I mean, they really are awful. Well, Larry Gassman, who was a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, Larry was a Trot in his younger days. So maybe the further left you go, if you're not a Democrat, but you're a real honest-to-God progressive, flaming leftist Marxist type kind of guy, maybe you're actually more susceptible to truly radical critiques. And libertarianism provides truly a radical critique of contemporary political society. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think we can attract, and indeed, we are attracting people from both political parties. There are refugees from the other parties in the Libertarian Party. Let me share with you, by the way, an interesting datum, or at least I think it's interesting. When I first started gathering petition signatures for the Libertarian Party, it was 1988. Ron Paul was the Libertarian Party presidential candidate. And if someone would come up to me and say, usually with some foul modifier, "You miserable son of a bitch, I'm not going to sign your petition. And let me tell you why I'm not going to sign your petition." It was typically a somewhat libertarian-oriented Republican who liked the libertarian ideas, or at least a lot of them, but said, we get that libertarian on the ballot, doggone it's going to steal votes from the good guy, or, not the really good guy, but the much, much better guy than the other bad guy. In other words, he's going to steal votes from the Republican. By 2004, when I was gathering in Charlottesville, Virginia, the Berkeley of the Blue Ridge, as we like to call it, if someone would say, "I'm not going to sign your petition, and let me explain to you why I'm not going to sign your petition," it was about 50-50 libertarian-oriented Republicans and hard left Democrats who would say, "If I put your guy on the ballot, it's going to take votes from my guy." That's a very interesting change in a relatively short period of time. I mean, one of the things that we have seen, the Snowden revelations. Arguably, Snowden was the biggest story of last year. The ramifications of that will be felt for a very long time. And there are a lot of people who are self-identified progressives who are starting to see that the libertarians are actually their friends on an awful lot of very important issues for them. And how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You don't have to get people to come over and become whole hog libertarian. In fact, let me riff on that point. One of the things that I see, particularly among young libertarians, because the libertarian perspective is indeed a beautiful perspective. Our ideas are truly beautiful ideas. There's a tendency on the part, particularly of those who've newly embraced these ideas, to be fervent evangelicals about those ideas. Have you bathed in the bracing waters of Murray Rothbard? Have you seen the light? Have you seen the great white light? I could have been a pretty good Baptist minister, I think. Come in and have the confession, young man. You confess your sins. We are evangelical about sharing a beautiful vision. And in many cases, we're very disappointed when people don't become what I call whole hog libertarians. They don't embrace fully the libertarian perspective. That's not fair of us. People move, in many cases, very gradually. It's not some sort of massive tectonic plate shift. They move very gradually because they start seeing more and more evidence that makes sense to them. And many of the biggest victories you win are not because you help find the next, the next house. You don't find the next great exemplars of libertarianism, but because you help keep people from going the opposite direction. Let's say that all you do by virtue of explaining the libertarian perspective with courtesy, with respect, listening to what the other people have to say, because, sometimes they actually have really good questions. Sometimes they actually have very good points. If you treat people with courtesy and respect, you explain the ideas, you give them a good, uncaricatured view of the libertarian perspective. So that if all you do is clarify the misconceptions, look how much progress you've made. Look how far you've moved the ball down the field. Why? Because in so many cases, I'm sure you've come across this. People say, "Well, you libertarians believe," and then they'll come up, "Oh, you libertarians hate the poor." No. You libertarians don't like the environment. You want us to all be sucking down nasty, toxic fumes, or you want the planet to burn by virtue of increased CO2 emissions, methane emissions. No. Well, you libertarians believe Brazil is a libertarian paradise. No. By the way, that came from a real-life example. I participated in a Marxist studies group at the University of Virginia. They did know, by the way, that Karl Marx was not a member of the Marx Brothers. That was about this degree of sophistication. And I actually had a professor of government at the University of Virginia say, "Well, you libertarians think of Brazil as some sort of libertarian paradise." I have a bit of a sardonic wit that I have to keep in check. So my natural inclination was, how stupid can you really be? I mean, I realized the University of Virginia intelligence is not required. Evidently, looking at you, they must not consider it desirable. But I kept my sardonic wit in check, and I said, well, sir, frankly, that's not true. I don't know any libertarian who looks at Brazil as a libertarian paradise. Let me return to the point I was making. In many cases, people look at libertarianism they look at a bad caricature of what we're all about. If all you do by virtue of treating people with courtesy and respect, if you just clarify the misconceptions, look how much progress you can make. Because in politics, people, in many cases, are more motivated by fear or hatred than by love. What will motivate them to get involved and fight against you? They don't like the libertarians. If you convince them, by virtue of nothing else, because you're just a decent person who treats other people the right way, if you say, you know, those libertarians, I disagree with them, perhaps they're crazy on some issues, but doggone it, they're basically decent people. You know, they're not going to steal my wallet, they're not going to send my kid to die in some damn foreign meat grinder. They're not going to surveil me. I may disagree with them, but they're basically decent people. Look how much progress you've made. Because again, in many cases in politics, people what will motivate them is because they feel they have to fight you. You're a danger to them. If they start thinking, you know, those libertarians, if they're in positions of responsibility, the world's not going to go to hell, look how much progress you've made. And in many cases, you don't know how much progress you made. You don't know how much good you're doing simply by being a good person who treats people the right way. You may be having an enormous impact in your community simply by being, if you're known as the libertarian, if you're a person of honor, of integrity, if you're a person who treats other people the right way so that you become the exemplar, oh, those libertarians, they're people like Barbara Howe. Nice people. The sort of people I'd like to have a beer with. May disagree with them on politics, but they're nice people. The world's not going to go to hell if they're in positions of responsibility. You have made enormous progress. Further questions, comments, arguments? Yes, sir.
Would you speculate on what might be the effects on the Libertarian Party if Rand Paul should receive the 2016?
Okay, did everyone hear the gentleman's question? He was asking about the effect of the Libertarian Party vis-a-vis if indeed Rand Paul were to receive the nomination of the Republican Party. The short answer is I don't know. The longer, more nuanced answer is I don't know, but I have some ideas. I think that Rand Paul, you know, you heard the old expression about a broken clock is right twice a day. I think a lot of Rand Paul's impulses are basically decent. Unfortunately, some of them get covered up by impulses that are not quite so decent, not quite so good. I think there will be a lot of people in the liberty movement who will look at this and they'll say, look, we have Rand Paul versus somebody on the Democratic Party, and the somebody, I suspect, is not going to be somewhat libertarian-oriented. I'm willing to go out on a limb there. And so they will say, look, half a loaf is better than no loaf, or in Rand Paul's case, maybe a quarter of a loaf is better than no loaf. I long ago learned, my crystal ball broke a long time ago. When people ask me, Jim, what should I do? The short answer is, I don't know. The longer, more nuanced answer is, I don't know, but I can offer you my opinions. I think each activist for liberty must do what he thinks is best. I don't know what the right path is. I personally believe the Libertarian Party, I'm going to vote Libertarian for a variety of reasons, not least of which is because I want to respect myself in the morning. I want to be able to look at myself. When I look at myself in the mirror, I want to be able to smile and say, oh, God, what did I do in the voting booth? Oh, Lord. But each activist for liberty has to decide, is this the best action? I don't know. If somebody comes up and says, Jim, I'm a libertarian, but I think I can have more impact within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party, or by not being involved in politics at all. I say, well, the most important thing, I can't tell you what to do. What I can do is, this is why I'm involved in the Libertarian Party. I can explain my reasons. And if people find that compelling, fine. If they have a comparative advantage in working through one of the legacy parties, if that's where they can have the biggest impact for liberty, go do it. To me, the issue is, are you making a difference in the right direction? And that includes not screwing up what the rest of us are doing in say, the Libertarian Party. If you're moving things in the right direction and you happen to be working through one of the legacy parties, or you're not involved in politics at all, perhaps you're involved in issue politics as opposed to partisan politics, perhaps you're just running your business and doing a good job, being a good person in your neighborhood. If that's what you can do best, that's what you should do. The most important thing for each liberty activist is to be honest with himself. To say, all right, look, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to accomplish. Well, be honest with yourself. Okay, you, Mr. or Ms. person involved in the Republican Party. You think that you're moving liberty in the right direction via your involvement. Are you doing it? Come up with a proper way of evaluating, are you actually doing what you want to accomplish? Be honest with yourself. If you think that you're actually doing things the right way, if you're moving the ball down the field in the right direction, okay. It may not be what I would choose to do. It may not be what I would recommend that you do. I may disagree with your strategy, your tactics, but it's not my life. You have to do what you think is best, but at least be honest with yourself. Evaluate what you are doing. Are you actually making the difference? And if you're not, then find a better game. I had the honor of serving as Libertarian Party National Chair. I would tell any Libertarian Party member, if you don't think that your best effect is to be involved in the Libertarian Party, you can do things in better fashion outside the party, then you should do what you need to do. Because the goal is liberty. The Libertarian Party is a tool. I think it's a valuable tool. I've invested a heck of a lot of money and time in it. I think it's a valuable tool. I think the Libertarian Party has made an enormous contribution to the spread of libertarian ideas. I think we have served as a very important transmission vector for libertarian ideas. I'm willing to go out and say most Libertarian Party people probably did not get their libertarianism because they read a lot of books. They probably encountered the libertarian ideas through a political campaign and then read the books. At least that was the way I went about it. I first heard about the Libertarian Party, or the libertarian ideas in a coherent fashion, as an outgrowth of a political campaign, the 1976 presidential campaign. So I think it's, in terms of moving the ball down the field, there are many ways of doing it. The Libertarian Party, I think, is a very valuable vehicle. Indeed, the people who are probably the most severe critics of the progress made by the Libertarian Party are Libertarian Party members. I think people who understand politics properly defined, understand what a tremendous impact upon American political life the Libertarian Party has had. By the way, part of that impact, if I may suggest, is we've kept the other parties from being a hell of a lot worse. And I think that's particularly true with respect to the Republican Party on certain important issues. 1994, you may recall, there was a big push for a major piece of gun control legislation at the end of April, early May. It looked like the Republicans were going to completely cave in on that, and a few of them got some spine somewhere. And I think it's because they realized that if the Republican Party caved on this gun control issue, they were going to lose every liberty-oriented, every Second Amendment activist was going to, well, not everyone, but a lot of them were going to go out of the Republican Party. Now, would they have come over to the Libertarian Party? Probably not. But they probably would have left the Republican Party. And that would have meant a huge drop in terms of the number of people who actually get things done on Election Day, actually are motivated to go out and work. So perhaps just by sheer horse manure luck, they managed to avoid a catastrophe. But I think had there not been a Libertarian Party that was constantly pushing for a robust interpretation of the right to keep and bear arms issues, you might have seen the Republican Party cave on a lot of right to keep and bear arms issues, and thus, because they were afraid that they would lose people to us, and thus some of them got some backbone. They actually saw, by the way, maybe they were convinced by reality as well, they actually saw that there is actually a pretty big constituency for a robust interpretation of the right to keep and bear arms. Most people are not nearly so afraid of the right to keep and bear arms as mass media would suggest. So, again, I think that we of libertarian disposition who are involved in the Libertarian Party, we need to understand the Libertarian Party is a tool. I think it's a good tool. It's one I'm willing to participate in. I wouldn't be down here. I wouldn't have driven 3.5 hours to come here and give an hour speech if I didn't think it was important. But we should always make it clear to fellow activists for liberty that if they feel that they can do a better job moving the ball down the field in other ways, as far as I'm concerned, that's fine. Just don't screw things up for the rest of us. Don't get in my way, and I'll try to stay out of yours. Further questions or comments? Now you have important things to do, so are you giving me the hook, JJ? No, well, that's a dangerous thing to say because I will. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Any particular insight or anecdotes to share from the gubernatorial race last year where the Libertarian candidate
yes.
spanked the spread?
Yes. The gentleman... The gentleman is referring to the campaign by Robert Sarvis for governor in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I have several comments, some of which I'll make in public, some of which I prefer to say in private. It was fascinating to see, and it really was the first time in my life I had seen the legacy parties nominate two people whom even their own members, for the most part, couldn't stand. The only advantage, actually, that's not fair. Let me backtrack a little bit. That's not fair because in the Republican Party there were a lot of people, relatively speaking, who felt that Attorney General Cuccinelli, Ken Cuccinelli, was actually very good on some issues. And in fairness, he was good on some issues. Some eminent domain issues, he was actually pretty good. He did try very hard to keep Virginia out of the clutches of Obamacare. So he was actually pretty good on some issues. And he talked, like many Republicans, he talked a pretty good game. By the way, Ronald Reagan, I listened to Reagan's radio broadcasts. This was back in my graduate school days a long time ago. This was the better part of 40 years ago. Reagan could bring tears to your eyes. He could talk about liberty in such a way you were ready to get out and start applauding, which a lot of people did. The talk, unfortunately, was a lot better than the reality. Well, in the case of the gubernatorial race in Virginia, Ken Cuccinelli did have his partisans within the Republican Party. A lot of people felt he was actually pretty good on some issues, and in fairness, he was good on some issues. McAuliffe, who is now Governor McAuliffe, I haven't found anybody, including Democrats, who liked Terry McAuliffe. Terry McAuliffe's sole virtue, from the perspective of most Democrats, as far as I can tell, was he could beat the Republican. That was it. Terry McAuliffe has a reputation, I think justified, for being sort of the poster child for what's wrong for a lot of liberals in terms of politics, the corruption, the big money. So it's sort of like, I think that pantomime was a pretty good approximation for a lot of Democrats. And Republicans, well, a lot of Republicans decided to come over because they told me, I'm going to vote for your guy. I was at a dinner party on January 17th. A gentleman who was a retired engineer, originally from South Carolina, he found out, I don't know how he found out that I was a libertarian. I can't imagine. I guess it was because of the big sign that they had me put on when I attended the dinner, Dr. Lark, the Libertarian. He said, for the first time in my life, I voted for a Libertarian because I couldn't stand that goddamn Cuccinelli. Excuse me. So, when analyzing the Virginia gubernatorial race, it is important to realize that for a lot of people, they looked at Tweedledum and Tweedledummer, and they said, that Sarvis guy, he can speak in complete sentences. He doesn't look like a sleazeball. He's actually got a lovely wife and kids. And by the way, his wife's charming. I mean, one of the greatest assets to Rob Sarvis was he married well. His wife, who is an African American, they are literally a mixed marriage, I think helped him tremendously. His wife is absolutely charming. They have lovely children, well-behaved children. Never underestimate the importance of choosing your spouse wisely. And she was very supportive of him, which was extremely important, how supportive she was of her husband.
I haven't chosen one yet, so I feel very wise.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think what happened also, as they say in Hollywood, timing is everything. A PAC was formed by, it was Ed Crane, formerly head of Cato, was involved in a PAC that could dole out something like $300,000 to help with advertising. And the Sarvis campaign had they had very good campaign slogans, and they drew the contrast between Tweedledum and Tweedledummer. Rob also, I think for the first time in Virginia history, we had someone who was, for all intents and purposes, able to be a full-time candidate. Rob had just completed, I should say Mr. Sarvis, we're friends, but I should properly, Mr. Sarvis, had completed a master's degree at George Mason University. He was working on a master's degree in economics. And his wife is a physician who was doing an residency. And he essentially had the opportunity to campaign all over the Commonwealth. We had, for all intents and purposes, a full-time candidate, which is something we'd never had before. He worked hard. There were a lot of people who found him to be a nice guy, because he's a nice guy. And it was a big horse race story, because it was one of only 2 gubernatorial elections in the United States. And so it drew a fair amount of attention. A fair number of libertarians became, they sort of got off the sidelines because we had a candidate who actually looked like he might achieve the 10%. At least for a while, it looked like he might achieve the 10%. And by the way, as a tidbit, nothing succeeds like success. If we see success, let's say we have a breakthrough somewhere. Maybe it's accidental, but we have a breakthrough somewhere. You're going to see libertarians coming out of the woodwork. There are so many libertarians who were involved many years ago who felt that their efforts were not seeing the fruits of their labors. You show libertarians that their efforts are bearing fruit, they'll work themselves to death. They'll work incredibly hard if they see the prospect of success. I mean, you guys are working your fannies off, and hopefully you do see the signs of success. You should see some signs of success. Think what happens when we actually get a United States governor elected, a governor of a big state. You need me to?
No, question.
I'm sorry. No, please, go ahead.
So it's always good to prepare for success.
Yes.
Which may include also the opposition and the dirty tricks that will try to shoot down our best efforts. Any thoughts on good things to think about as we're doing this, prepare for the nastiness that could come later to try to shoot
the gentleman's point is most astute, and as a matter of fact, we're already seeing the dirty tricks. Although in some cases, is it better to deal with people who are evil or stupid? I used to think it was better to deal with the stupid because, stupid people perhaps could be educated. I've actually now come around to the idea that it may actually be better to have to deal with evil people, because at least if they can see boundaries. When you say black, they think black. When you say white, they think white, as opposed to you say black, they think plaid or green or something like that. Stupid people are, in many cases, incredibly heroic and will crash through boundaries that can cause enormous carnage. Evil people, you might be able to draw boundaries around them and say, don't do this, because if you do, you're going to get hurt, and they'll respect those boundaries. I think the best way to deal with the problems, and actually, I don't know if I should say the best way. There may not be a best way. I think the most important things you can do are be out there in the community. If you're going to run for office, it really helps if you are known in your community, so that people can say, this guy or this lady, these are good people, so that when the bullshit starts, it's easy to deflect it, because people say, wait a minute, that just doesn't resonate. I'm sorry.
Deal with the evil people using stupid people against you.
That's right. That's right. And that is a possibility. And unfortunately, I mentioned the asymmetry of libertarians not liking politics. There's another asymmetry. And how shall I put this? It's easier for people to dump poop. You can dump poop faster than you can shovel it out or hose it out. George Benston, who was one of Milton Friedman's students. He was one of my colleagues 30 years ago at the University of, I was a visiting scholar, visiting schmuck at the Center for Research in Government Policy and Business at the University of Rochester. George Benston went to hear a talk by Michael Harrington. Michael Harrington was the founder of Democratic Socialists of America, who wrote the book The Other America. George Benston heard his talk and made the observation that Harrington, in the course of a minute, would make on average 2 mistakes, either of substance, interpretation, 2 serious errors. It would take me at least 15 minutes to have a hope of cleaning up any one of those mistakes. A lot of times people can dump poop faster than we can shovel, and we have to be aware of that. So what we have to try to do as best as possible is to make sure that we set the agenda, we set the high ground, we're out there campaigning hard and showing people that we actually do believe in the good things in life. We have better ways of achieving them than what we now see that are being advocated typically by Republicans and Democrats. One point, by the way, there's been if you put a gun to my head, and that's probably not the place to shoot, because if you shoot my head, there's not much up there, so it may not hurt me. If you put a gun to my head and ask me, how will the Libertarian Party ultimately achieve success? Again, the short answer is I don't know. The longer, more nuanced answer is I don't know. My opinion is it's probably because we change the terms of the debate. In other words, we are successful by virtue of being a vanguard party that basically expands the discussion to include the ideas of liberty. I think what happens is if we are successful, and I think we will be in the sense of finding more and more people of libertarian disposition who will embrace our ideas, our candidates, our policies, the legacy parties will have to start moving in a libertarian direction out of self-preservation. We're already seeing that in some, albeit much smaller than I would like to see. We're already seeing that. So my gut feeling is that the way we'll be successful is not so much because we'll have a libertarian president, but because we have set the agenda, and more the other politicians have to do what we libertarians want them to do. They will do it kicking and screaming, but they will move in our direction. Now, contrary to rumor, I've been wrong before, so take what I'm saying with the appropriate size grain of salt. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an extraordinary honor and pleasure for me to address you. One of the great things in my life is I have the privilege of getting together with freedom fighters, with heroes. Thank you for allowing me to be with a group of heroes. Thank you.